I'm sure his expertise will soon become evident. So without further ado, please help me give a warm welcome.
Thank you, Mari. I'd like to really thank Mari Tanabe and Mia, and Marlos, the president of the local STAN chapter, Jeff Mandel, who's been carting me around, and all the STAN members I've worked with. It's really a joy and an honor to be here. This conference has confirmed my impressions that human rights and student activities in general are an excellent crucible of leadership. I mean, you are all amazing leaders, and it's just a pleasure to be with you. At first, I thought I wouldn't make it because I had a competing event in the Midwest, but then Mari was a very persuasive arm twister. So the arm has nothing to do with the DRC. It has lots to do with the IC tarmac on which I slipped coming back from Afghanistan. You know, we were shot at by the Taliban and everything, not really, but my contribution to the war effort was slipping on the tarmac on Kurdistan on the way back, so I'm not a hero. In the human rights world, sometimes you really need to relax and kick back a little bit, because as you've seen, when you talk about some of these issues, it can be very, very depressing. In fact, I think it was Socrates who said, the unexamined life is not worth living. Well, if you examine your life and the way mobile phones, for example, contribute to the Congo, you almost want to kill yourself. I mean, it's really a great example. This particular issue is about how we are connected to the world and how our actions have an impact, even on distant lands like the DRC. So it's a great honor to stand with you, Mari, and to be with the rest of you, and to actually say enough to these human rights violations. And stopping the conflict minerals in the supply chain is obviously critical. In my time with you today, I've been asked to address 3 topics. I'm going to do that. The first one is to tell you a little bit about my personal experiences. I don't do that, but there were some requests, since a lot of you are IR majors, international relations majors, and so forth. I'll talk a little bit about my personal experiences and how this apparently schizophrenic life of mine on the corporate side and the legal and human rights side isn't so schizophrenic. I think they're actually quite interrelated. Secondly, I plan to give you an overview of some of the key legal issues and the pending legislation in this area. We've heard a little bit about that, but I'll elaborate. And then finally, I'll address the larger human rights context, including some of the complexities in the area, some of the paradoxes. Now, I came to these issues and an abiding interest in Africa through having grown up in the Old South, in Louisiana, in the United States, where we had Jim Crow law still, the impacts of de facto segregation were still quite apparent. You know, we had parts of town that were for black people, parts of town that were for white people. And, you know, the two sides didn't mix except for domestic servants and so forth. So it was really a pretty bad place. I actually was a Catholic growing up, and that influenced my values a little bit. I went to a Catholic school called, I kid you not, Our Lady of Prompt Succor. Now, you can imagine what that would do to a kid, right? But the motto wasn't just traumatic. It actually did impact my life in a good way, because prompt succor means quick assistance. And so I grew up with the idea that you actually did have to help others. And I had 2 experiences when I was growing up that were remarkably similar to 2 experiences in Lisa Shannon's new book about the DRC and the Congo. This is a fabulous book, by the way. It just came out recently. It's called 1,000 Sisters, and you have to read it. It's a beautiful, personalized version of her weeks in the Congo, interviewing people and making videotapes of them. And she chronicles the actual on-the-ground stories of the sisters that are affected by these atrocities that we're talking about. But she talks about, you know, her experience on a bus, standing up with someone subject to racial discrimination. And the same thing happened to me when I was young. Well, first of all, before that, when I was a first grader at Our Lady of Prompt Succor, I saw some kids, and I was, again, very young. They were probably 2nd, 3rd graders, tormenting a bird. And, you know, you may not think that, you know, that would trigger an instinct in a kid, but it did. I kind of went to the rescue of the bird, and I was a very young kid at this time. And remember the bird, because we'll come back to that at the end. Then when I was a little bit older, a couple of years later, I saw 2 older teenagers basically terrorizing a beautiful elderly black woman. And I did the same thing. I kind of intervened, even though I was a couple of years younger. And the same thing happened to Lisa. She had 2 similar experiences. I don't think that these are that unique. I think that all of us have experiences like that in your lives. You know, we all have that sort of recognition of empathy, of concern for the other person. And that's basically the sort of experience that shapes your attitude toward life. A little thing like that can have a huge impact, and it certainly did in my life. It basically means that you're living a life aware of what's happening around you. You're engaged with the life of your times, as you guys are, and you care about justice. When you see something wrong, you speak up against it, you take action against it. And that's basically what human rights is all about. So, when I was a student like you, I was the only one in the room that raised his hand or her hand when the question came up, was anyone involved in the anti-apartheid movement? And I was. That was my stand. That was, when I was young, I got involved in the divestment movement, the anti-apartheid movement, protesting before Parliament, writing letters and so forth, with Amnesty International, then with Oxfam, and what's now Human Rights First. It was in the Lawyers Committee. It was an easy step from protesting the U.S. discrimination in the Old South to protesting against the formal apartheid in South Africa, of course. And there, positive lessons learned. Who would have thought there would have been a bloodless revolution in South Africa? And I did. I was happy to see the end of apartheid and to take heart from that. But the issues go on. Even today, there's a multi-billion-dollar lawsuit, legal accountability lawsuit, where companies that were involved and complicit in supporting the apartheid regime are now being sued by Paul Hoffman in LA under the Alien Tort Claims Act. And so this idea of corporate accountability, it's not a completely new idea, but it's taking on greater steam, and that's definitely a good thing. It's become more important with globalization. And so after I was a student protester, I actually applied for a public interest job with the ACLU, with the Center for Constitutional Rights. I didn't even get my resume acknowledged. It was much harder then to get a job in those areas. There are a lot more of those opportunities now for you to work in an NGO or an international development agency and to have a tangible impact, to work with enough, for example. I know some of you have been wooed by enough, and I hope that some of you will go work for organizations like that. With globalization, which really took off after that time, there was an opportunity to be an international lawyer and help companies in the global environment. So that's what I did. I couldn't get a job with a public interest law firm, so I sold out and worked as a corporate lawyer, which wasn't that bad, actually. You build good skills that you can then use in your human rights activity. And so that's what I was constrained to do. I was basically doing a lot of pro bono activities on the side, representing women and children and men, political refugees, asylees from Africa, from Latin America, from Eastern Europe, who were seeking asylum from persecution in the United States, and so forth. Now, there were also, at that time, the other dynamic that we haven't really talked about is the way that global supply chains were really becoming integrated. You had waves of globalization in the old, chartered company period, and then around World War I, and then there was a retrenchment, and in the 20th century it just took off. And really in the late 70s, early 80s, it exploded. So it was a great opportunity for young lawyers to be involved. And I even got involved with some clients, like Starbucks, you heard about them earlier today, like The Body Shop, Nita Roddick's company, that were actually trying to make globalization more ethical. And that was an exciting thing to be a part of. Trying to have fair trade in the supply chains, the cafe, the supply chain fair trade program of Starbucks. Great to see that. So this is a brief experience or survey of my experience. After practicing in private practice, doing this pro bono on the side, and then seeing the way that my volunteer activities were coming together with my practice with clients like Starbucks and The Body Shop, I saw that you don't really have to take a job in a public interest law firm, or with a public interest NGO. There are ways, you can work in a corporation, and it's now more important than ever as these companies have become so powerful with a daily impact on our lives greater than a lot of nation states. Certainly, companies like GE and Starbucks, they really impact a lot of people in a way that small nations don't impact. And so there's a way to really exercise leadership within the private sector by engaging in these sorts of hybrid activities. So I urge you to keep that in mind.